History is written by the victors, and not surprisingly, they rewrite their own past in very glowing terms. We don't need to look much further than the Democrat Party, as it brands itself as the defender of civil rights and racial equality. Democrats want you to believe they have always fought for justice and side with the oppressed. But the truth? The truth has been buried, erased, and twisted beyond recognition. For over a century, the Democratic Party wasn't just indifferent to Black Americans, it was their greatest enemies and oppressors. Welcome to another exciting Liberty Bell broadcast video as we explore a controversial topic that many don't want us to know about: the dark history of one of America's most powerful political parties. This is part 1 in the Secret History of the Democrat Party series as we uncover the shameful crimes that were committed by this party against the millions of victims on American soil and abroad. I made these series primarily for high school and college students for use in research papers, as well as provide information for classroom discussions. But anyone who has a keen interest in politics and history can also appreciate the content. So please kindly show some gratitude by hitting that like button. And if you can subscribe to my channel plus share my videos with others, that would mean the world to me. Thanks a million. Slavery, segregation, lynching, disenfranchisement. These weren't just side effects of the times. They were policies Democrats fought to uphold. And while they now claim to be the party of racial justice, their history tells a far different story. This is the secret history of the Democratic Party, broken down piece by piece. But before we go further, let's start at the beginning, particularly with what they did to Black Americans. The Democratic Party was founded in the early 19th century, with strong ties to Southern slave owners. In fact, from the very beginning, they positioned themselves as the defenders of slavery and white supremacy. Leaders like Andrew Jackson, one of the earliest Democratic presidents, not only owned black slaves, but actively pushed policies that expanded slavery across the country. By the 1850s, Democrats had fought to spread slavery into new territories. They passed laws like the Fugitive Slave Act, forcing even free states to return runaway slaves to their owners. Imagine the terror of a black man or woman who had escaped to freedom in the North, only to be snatched away from their families and dragged back into bondage. The Democratic Party made sure that no enslaved person could ever be truly free. The very fabric of America was being torn apart by the fight over slavery, and the Democratic Party was leading the charge to keep black people in chains. While today's Democrats claim to champion human rights for black Americans, history shows that they fought tooth and nail to keep slavery alive. They were the party of southern plantations, forced labor, the breaking up of black families, and laws that stripped black people of their rights. Even in northern states, Democratic politicians defended slavery and racial discrimination. Many people incorrectly assume support for slavery was only limited to the South. But the reality is that Democrats in both the North and the South advocated for this cruel system.
The 4 bad guys of slavery, he names them. Tawney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision. Tawney he counts as a Southerner, because Tawney is from Maryland, not exactly South, but nevertheless. Franklin Pierce, the former president, from New Hampshire, Northern Democrat. Buchanan, the sitting president, from Pennsylvania, Northern Democrat. Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's rival, who ran against him both in Illinois and then later for the presidency, from Illinois, Northern Democrat. Notice 3 of the 4 are Northern Democrats. The Northern Democrats were in bed with the South on slavery.
Abolitionists fought to end slavery, but the Democratic Party stood in their way at every turn. In Congress, Democrats passed laws like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing slavery to expand westward. They supported the infamous Dred Scott decision, in which the Supreme Court, led by Democratic appointees, declared that black Americans were not citizens and therefore had no rights. This ruling shattered the hopes of countless black families who had fought for freedom, proving that under Democratic rule, their very humanity was denied. And let's not forget about the giant 200-ton blue whale in the room, the Civil War. Do you need me to remind you that it was the same Democrats that nearly destroyed America simply because they wanted to keep the slaves? Yeah, it was really that bad, not only for blacks, but for all Americans, as more than 620,000 war deaths resulted due to this most tragic event in our nation's history. Too bad for them, the Democrats and the Confederate Army lost. The Republic was saved, and blacks were finally set free to be American citizens. Even after slavery was abolished, Democrats found new ways to keep black Americans from gaining power. One of the most effective methods was the grandfather clause. This law stated that a person could only vote if their grandfather had been eligible to vote before the Civil War. Since enslaved people were not allowed to vote, this law automatically excluded newly freed black men. But it didn't end there. Democratic lawmakers passed Jim Crow laws, which legalized segregation and discrimination. Black Americans were denied access to quality education, jobs, and public facilities. In other words, blacks were second-class citizens in the very land that their parents and grandparents were born in. The Ku Klux Klan, KKK, was founded in 1865 by former Confederate soldiers, all Democrats. The Klan became the militant arm of the Democratic Party, using terror and violence to suppress black political power because blacks were voting Republican. Democratic politicians, especially in the South, often had direct ties to the Klan. In the 1920s, the Klan was so powerful that it helped elect Democratic officials all across the country.
Klan connection. In the early 1940s, as Robert Byrd sought to establish his political career, he made the controversial decision to join the Ku Klux Klan. Byrd was recruited by a neighbor, who introduced him to the Klan's local recruiter. Byrd later reflected on this period, admitting that he saw the Klan as a stepping stone in his political ascent rather than a genuine ideological alignment. Despite these claims, Byrd's involvement was active. He not only joined but also actively recruited members and was eventually elected Exalted Cyclops, the leader of his local chapter in Crab Orchard, West Virginia.
Joe Biden loved his mentor Robert Carlyle Byrd, who was a recruiter for the Klan while in his 20s, rising to the title of Kleagle and Exalted Cyclops.
Today, our country has lost a true American original, my friend and mentor, Robert C. Byrd. Senator Byrd was a man of surpassing eloquence and nobility, and I will remember him for many things.
Ah yes, fellow white Democrats praising high-ranking KKK Robert Byrd for being their leader, boss, friend, mentor, and guide. Thanks for incriminating yourself to the whole world, you Democrat racists.
Robert C. Byrd elevated the Senate. Every time I sat with a leader, I never called Senator Byrd Senator. I always called him leader. So boss, for a lot of us, he was a friend, and he was a mentor, and he was a guide. So I made a promise that no matter where I was, if he called me and said he needed my vote, I'd drop whatever I was doing and I'd come. And I kept the commitment. The only one, I might add. That got me back in his good graces again.
Lynching was one of the most horrifying tactics used to maintain white supremacy. Between 1882 and 1968, nearly 4,800 lynchings were documented, the vast majority targeting black Americans. Democratic politicians refused to pass anti-lynching laws, allowing the violence to continue for decades. Think about how many lives could have been saved if these laws were passed. What a pity. When the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1950s and 60s, it was Southern Democrats who fought hardest to block change and justice. Big shots like Robert Byrd and George Wallace openly opposed desegregation. Wallace famously stood in a schoolhouse door to block black students from entering the University of Alabama. Robert Byrd was no low-ranking KKK member. He held the top position of Exalted Cyclops and recruited 150 young men into his local KKK charter in West Virginia. Later, he became a top Democrat senator and the longest-serving senator in history. What a good Democrat he was. A fine example of the typical Democrat for all to see. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were only passed mainly because of Republicans with some moderate Democrats, while facing fierce opposition from the Democratic Party's southern wing. History is not always what it seems. The Democratic Party has been working hard to rewrite its past, but the facts remain. From slavery to segregation, from lynching to Jim Crow, the record is clear. But why don't schools and colleges teach this? They teach students about slavery, but hardly ever mention that the Democratic Party was the one fighting to keep it alive. They teach about the civil rights movement, but they gloss over the fact that it was Democrats who stood in the way, refusing to let Black Americans as well as other minorities the rights to vote, get an education, and live as equals. They teach about the KKK, but they don't tell you that the Klan was created by and filled with Democrats, protected by Democratic lawmakers, and used to terrorize Black voters from voting Republicans into office. Why is this part of history erased? Because the truth is dangerous. It threatens power. If people knew what the Democratic Party really stood for, if they understood the centuries of lies, they might start to wonder what else they've been lied to about. And that's exactly what they don't want. But the truth does matter. It matters because real people suffered under these policies. Black families were torn apart. Black men were lynched. Black women were denied the right to vote, the right to own businesses, the right to simply live free. The Democratic Party did everything in its power to make sure they remained at the bottom. And yet today, they claim to be the ones fighting for them. Does that make any sense? The real tragedy is that so many Black Americans have been convinced that the Democratic Party is on their side, that Democrats have changed and the past no longer matter. But how can a party that built its power on racism and violence suddenly become the champion of racial justice? Can a system designed to oppress all minorities, particularly blacks, suddenly make a complete 180-degree turn to become the party of diversity, equality, and inclusion? We all know the truth. Research for yourself and ask, who's really on your side? Stay tuned for part 2, where I will uncover even more of what they've been trying to hide. But until then, share this video with your classmates and colleagues. And for the brave hearts among us, feel free to bring up the topics I have mentioned in your classrooms for debate. I made this talking point summary to make it easier for discussion.